It is my pleasure to introduce Tammy Shelton. Tammy has been in Tennessee and practicing education for 20 years. During that time, she's been a middle and a high school teacher and a principal and a supervisor of instruction for K-12. So she got all bases covered. She's a member of the Park Educational Leadership Cadre for the state, and currently she serves as the Executive Director of Content and Resources for the Tennessee Department of Education. Please welcome Tammy Shelton.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. In the back? Great, because I'm one of these folks that I don't do well standing behind the podium, and I'm also short. So if I stand behind the podium, you might only see from here up. So I'll kind of jump back and forth with the PowerPoint, but try to move away. I don't have the luxury of a few extra inches to manage to get above the podium. So today, if you noticed in the brochure, of course, you picked in the sessions and you signed up. This is teaching reading across the content areas. And so one of the things with that title, when we think about it, is that's been around a while. So you heard with the introduction that I've been in education 20 years, and I remember talking about reading in the content areas. We had PD on it and so forth over the years. So it's not something that's necessarily a new concept. If you've been in education a while, you probably had PD around that. But the thing is now, when we talk about the literacy standards and Common Core, we're really talking about the same thing. First off, before we get started, I kind of want to see who's with me in the audience so that I can, as I talk through it, maybe pull in some examples from some of your area. So how many principals or assistant principals, you're an administrator at a building level that we have with us? So a few in the room. How many of you are teachers? Okay, how many of you teach middle school and high school? So it's really what I'm going to focus on, mainly is middle school and high school. So now the next thing is I'm also going to focus on teachers of areas besides math and ELA. So how many of you teach something other than math and ELA? Science, social studies, career and technical education, fine arts, foreign language. Other subjects, great. So that's kind of one thing that I want to, is to talk specifically to you, to teachers and administrators in other content areas. In saying that, I also do want to go back and give you a couple of just some informative stuff that I might refer back to as I talk a little bit for the next hour. So I am, and you heard my title, Executive Director of Content Resources. It almost will not fit on a business card. What a title, very lengthy. So somebody the other day said they had a long title, and so as they said their title, I sat there and counted, and I thought, I've got you beat. So anyway, but what that basically means is that my department, we work with all of the standards except career and technical education. So fine art, you got a question there, call my number. Math, science, social studies, foreign language. So all the subjects that are the academic subjects are in our department. And then also we work with the resources that the State Department puts out. So textbooks, any curriculum resources that we might put our stamp of approval on, and those sorts of things. All of the summer training materials. If any of you are headed to summer training, we have summer training in science, social studies, and CTE, and all of those materials. So that's kind of what we do. But I wanted to make kind of one clarification. So in my department, I have individuals under me that work with specific content area. Because I generally deal with everything, but I have somebody under me that's a math expert. They got that deep math content knowledge. And we also have a person that's coordinator of English language arts. But when we think about English language arts, we divided that position into two. So there are two different people that really focus and have deep content knowledge in English language arts. And one of them deals with K-3 reading and K-12 learning to read. So if we think about that there might be a 6th grade student that's still an emerging or struggling reader, then that person deals with that. So even though their title states coordinator of reading, it's reading K-12 if the student's still learning to read, or K-3 for all students that are learning to read, because an emergent reader is an emergent reader whether they're in 11th grade or whether they're in 1st grade. And then we have coordinator of English language arts contents, and he deals with 412 English, reading, writing, kind of the whole gamut. And sometimes that falls down into also second and third grade. So in saying that, I really think about, when I think about English language arts and literacy in my department, I think about it in two ways. I think about it as that sometimes students are learning to read. And that's what we think of as K-3. That's what we think of as RTI and interventions and helping struggling students with readers. And then I also have a side where I think about reading to learn, to where students are reading the material to learn the content. And then that's what you are involved with when we think about reading in the content areas, that we are reading to learn. And that's where we pull in all teachers. It doesn't matter what you teach, it doesn't matter what your content is. If you have a textbook, there are words in your textbook. If you have any type of curriculum materials that you put in front of your students, it has words in it. So your students have to read your content, and they read that content to learn the content. So that's one of the areas and the things then want to focus on as we go through this afternoon. So a couple of things. First, and if you sat in the session in this room right before lunch with Emily Barton, then she went through the shifts for math and ELA, and so I'm going to go through the shifts for English language arts, but I'm going to go through it with a little bit different kind of eye than she went through it. Because as she went through this shift, she was really thinking a lot about English language arts, and I want to go through these shifts thinking about teachers of other subject areas besides English language arts. So the first shift, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. And so I'm just going to completely say informational text from this point on, because what we're thinking about for you in your course is informational text. Also, reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text, both literary and informational. So I just made literary small, informational big, because that's all I'm going to talk to for the next hour is just informational. It's very, very important that students can, when they get to the workforce, be able to read and write and, of course, speak as well, and be able to do that and produce the evidence that they need in the workforce. At this point, before I go on, I want to say something that I actually thought about in the last session. In thinking about college and career ready. So when we think about the Common Core State Standards, and we think about college and career ready, lots of times we only hear the word college ready, and we don't hear the and career, but it's really together. And so I spent not only 20 years in Tennessee, and I'm going to go back to the same thought, in 20 years in Tennessee education, but I spent it in Lincoln County, Tennessee. If you're not familiar where that is, it's about an hour south of here. Maybe a little bit farther, probably about an hour and 15 minutes. It borders Alabama, and that's a very rural community. And so, as I started back when I was a principal, and then when I went to supervisor of instruction, I worked with my teachers, and we really started talking about college and career. And this was actually back before Common Core. We were talking about ACT and how to improve our ACT scores. And so at that point, a lot of the comments I got were, why do all of our students have to take the ACT? Why are we worried about all of our students being successful in ACT? Because not all of our students are going to go to college. So at that time, it was the same conversation. We want college and career ready, and ACT is a benchmark for college and career as well. So at that time, thinking about our small county, which is almost a sleeper county for Huntsville, Alabama, we only have 2 large factories in our county. And so the second largest factory in the county, they actually give a test to prospective employees before they will interview. And so in talking with that industry in my particular county and looking at that exam and discussing it with them and seeing what do you need the high school graduates in my particular county to be able to do to come, get a job in your factory. In looking at that, the math portion and the reading portion of that test that they did to get an interview was about the equivalent of a 19 on the ACT. So the students that were graduating from my high school, they needed the equivalent of a 19 to be able to get an interview at our local industry. So it's not just college ready, it's also career ready as well. So these skills and everything that we're talking about is both. So it's really important that we realize it's all of our students, whether they're going straight to a job or whether they're going straight to college or technical school, whichever the case may be. And so the third shift is regular practice with complex text, and it's academic language. And so I'm going to talk about both of those a little more specifically. Like 10 seconds in just quiet think time and think about what was the last thing that you read at home. So in thinking about that, some of us may be readers, and you may have read a novel, but then a lot of you read other things like maybe a brochure that came in the mail around your health insurance. Maybe it was a manual because you got a new dishwasher or something like that. So we read a lot of things just at home, not even thinking about our job. It's a very complex text. I got a new washing machine about 6 months ago. Oh my goodness. For years it was easy. I could do the dials. It was all digital. I finally gave up and I got the manual out and I read the manual for my washing machine, which seems crazy. We, on a daily basis, not only in our daily lives, but in our work environments, read very complex text. It's much different than it used to be. And we'll talk a little more specifically about academic language as well. So the first shift that I want to talk about is building the knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. And so basically, why do we need this? Why do we need to build this knowledge? Well, students are required to read very little informational text in elementary and middle school. Now, Emily Barton actually talked about this, and she stole a little bit of my thunder, but she talked about this beforehand. So we've traditionally been reading literary all the way through. And I actually, talking with a third grade teacher when I was a supervisor back in my county, we were talking about this because we were really making a shift several years ago to try to pull in some more informational text throughout all the grades. And so when we were talking about it, one of the comments that this teacher made, she said, my students do very well if we read a story about the Easter Bunny, but they really struggle when we read a story about rabbits in our habitat with third grade students. So at that point, then it really hit home. I'm reading the research that says that informational text is more difficult for students. It's more complex and that they really need to work with that because that's what we do. But then when a teacher stood in front of me and stated that she saw that every day in her classroom with her third grade students, it really hit home. So it is very true. And we've traditionally done what? We've read the Easter Bunny in third grade. We've read the easy stuff. And we really, in our English classes, have hit home with the literature in middle school and high school. And when we think about the other subjects, science, social studies, history, CTE, we didn't read much at all. We gave them the information because we lectured to them, or even in CTE classes, we modeled for them and we showed them. And we didn't have them read at all. So they were reading very little in their other subjects, and they were reading literature in their English and reading courses as well. Nonfiction makes up the vast majority of required reading in college and workforce. So we've already talked about that. So, and Emily Martin mentioned this as well. How many careers can we think about that actually deal with literature on a daily basis? We read memos. We read reports. Of course, we go through emails, and some of us have bosses that'll write a book for an email. So we read on a daily basis in our job, and we're reading informational text. We're not reading literature, so we need to work with our students to prepare them for this. And I've already mentioned that it's much harder for students to read and comprehend informational text versus literary. And it supports our students learning on how to read different types of informational text. Now, one thing I want to bring out right here is thinking about sequencing text in our classroom. So if we give students a piece of informational text, it is very good to give them more than one, and that's actually in standards for them with their English language arts standards. So if I am in, let's say, for science at high school, and so we're going to read something to do with maybe a disease that affects just, horses and so forth, and we're talking about breeding on a farm and a disease that affects just the horses in a horse science class at high school, then instead of just pulling in maybe one journal article on that, I might pull in one journal article, and then I might pull in a pamphlet from a veterinarian's office and let them read both pieces, so that I actually have given them multiple pieces of text on the same subject with that. And it will really help students be able to analyze that text as well. So it's a very good idea not to just pull one piece from the book, but to give them a sequence of text. And if you were in the meeting earlier, you heard Ms. Barton talk about the fact that our reading test went from having the very low-level prompt of talking about finding a treasure box to students reading a piece of text and then analyzing that piece of text, in their answer. So we will move to reading multiple texts, and on PARC, they will read multiple texts. So students are going to have to not only be able to read a piece of text, to be able to analyze it, and be able to produce evidence from it in their writing, they're also going to have to be able to read multiple texts, analyze both pieces, and then in their writing produce evidence from those two pieces of text. So it is important, and something that we need to do is to have a sequence of text, not just one text for our students. And in saying that, since I just mentioned the writing test, if you were in that, you saw some of the examples where it was science. That third grade ELA question was science in the content. When you see PARC, you're going to see social studies, science, and some other subject areas. So the content of PARC, ELA, will be your content, your subjects. So it will pull in science, social studies, some CTE classes. So we'll pull in that content for that test. So students are not just taking an English test, but they're taking that English or that ELA test, and they're writing, and they're doing that with your content. So it's very important, and you are critical to the success of our students on that PARC test when they get to it, because they're going to be going through your content. So here are a couple of standards that I've listed up here. So the first one is a 5th grade standard. So the RI here stands for Reading Informational Text. It's 5th grade, it's standard number 10. I pulled standard number 10 from several different grade levels. So here is the literacy standard. And this is for history. This is reading and history. So this second standard that I have listed is the literacy standard for history. So if you're a social studies teacher out there, and if you're a 9-12 social studies teacher, this second standard is actually your standard. The bottom one is actually science and technical subjects. So it's basically everybody else in the room. If you're not an English or math teacher and you're not a history teacher, and you're 6-12, 6-8, then the bottom standard is yours. So when we just look at these really quickly, so I'm just going to read one, but I want you to look at the one that probably is closest to the area that you teach. So I'm going to read the middle of school literacy standard for science and other subjects. By the end of grade 8, read and comprehend science and technical text in the grade 6-8 complexity band independently and proficiently. So basically what that's saying is our students are going to need to be able to read complex texts by the end of 8th grade in their science class and any other subjects that they might have there, and they're going to need to be able to do it independently and proficiently. So standard number 10 is basically a standard that says we should read informational text, and standard number 10 reads like this across the whole thing. For English, standard number 10 reads very similarly at the grade levels, all the way through high school, and then for science or for history and all other subjects, standard number 10 reads very similarly. Basically, it says we should read informational text, and it should be complex, and the students should be able to read it proficiently by the end of the grade level that they happen to be in at that point. So here we see, and there's been a lot of discussion with English teachers and various educators about this slide. So this basically tells us the distribution of literary versus informational text. And so you see as we go up in grade level, we go from 4th to 12th grade here, the literary portion that the students should read in the day decreases, and the informational text they should read during their day increases. You will find this in the standards. So if you go to the standards, you'll find this. Now the thing is the first thing usually that an English teacher, when they see this, they think is, oh my, does that mean I'm not going to be able to teach? No, that is not what this means. This means that approximately 70% of a student's day should be informational text. Research shows that in 9-12 at the high school, that those English classes should be 25% informational text. So if in their English class they're only having 25% of that class informational text, where are they going to get the rest of the informational text that they should be reading during the day? That's your classes. They're reading it in science, they're reading it in their welding class, they're reading it in their health science class, they're reading it in social studies. That's where they're reading it. So that 70% is their day, not their English class. And then 30% there. So you see that we increase as we go up in grade level, and it will take teachers of other subjects, it will take you to help those students reach that 70% in informational text, and it will also take you to help them be successful on PARC as they go through. So I want you to take, if you could, just 30 seconds and read this screen. So the grade 6-12 standards are divided into two sections, one for ELA and the other for history, social studies, science, and technical subjects. This division reflects the unique time-honored place of ELA teachers in developing students' literacy skills, while at the same time recognizing that teachers in other areas must have a role in this development as well. So, in saying that, I want you to take, we're going to take about a minute, or a couple of minutes. Let's take about 2 or 3 minutes, and I want you to turn to a partner or somebody near you, and I want you to think about these questions. Now, if you are not right now a teacher in another subject area besides English, if you're an administrator, maybe you taught science, social studies, or CTE beforehand, but think about that. If it's not your subject, then pick a subject, and I want you to keep that subject in mind as you answer these questions. So turn to a partner and discuss these questions, and we'll take 2 minutes. Working with literacy in other subject areas stems from a great deal of research, and that in college, the reading that's required there is much more difficult, and we've already talked about that kind of at length, and that the structure of what they're reading in the informational text is much more challenging at college as well at that level. And also the volume and the amount that they are reading is much more at college. And this is one thing, if you know much, I know I don't have a lot of elementary teachers in here, but if you know much about struggling readers, one of the main areas that struggling readers, or the areas that they have trouble with in elementary is fluency. And so that's huge. And then if they are going to post-secondary, whether it is technical school, whether it's a four-year university, whether it's a community college, the amount of reading that they're going to do when they hit that level is huge. And we have a lot of students that struggle with fluency. And the more they read, their fluency is going to improve. And you know, if they're reading your history content, that's great. And it's also helping them improve in that area. That's going to help them be more successful once they pass you as well. The last one talks about it just talks about the NAEP test requires high and increasing proportion of informational text on the NAEP test. PARC's going to as well. We've already talked about that. And it requires more as students advance through the grades. And one thing that I'd already mentioned that I just want to mention again is the content that they will read on English Language Arts and PARC will be your content. It will be your area. So looking at the second shift, I'm going to move on to the second one, which is reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text. And in looking at that, we want students to be able to locate and deploy that evidence. And doing that is a really big indicator of strong readers and writers. Of course, with college and the workplace, it requires evidence from the text. And one of the examples I've used for this one for years is that as a supervisor of instruction, since you're teachers, y'all know this example, in my district, if I walked into my director and I sat down across from her desk and I said, you know what, I have found this great program that's going to help our struggling math students in middle school, and I really think we need to purchase it. We need to spend this gigantic sum, because we know vendors charge us a fortune. So we need to spend this gigantic sum of money on this math intervention for middle school because it's great. And she's going to, okay, well, tell me about it. I'm going to say, it's just great. I really like it. It's good. I watched them. They did the presentation. I think it's great. Is she going to buy it? No. I'm going to have to pull out the guns. I'm going to have to start talking about the research. I'm going to have to pull the evidence that this many students on this and this. And I also called and talked to this county, 3 counties over, and they're using this program, and their TCAP scores went from here to here. I'm going to have evidence, and I'm going to have to pull multiple pieces of evidence together in order to get her to come on board and purchase that. You have to do that working daily. I mean, you as a teacher, if you find some materials that you want, you go to your principal and you ask them to purchase it. Usually it takes more than, oh, I just like this and I want to buy it. So no matter what our jobs are, no matter what we're doing, we have to be able to produce the evidence. And lots of times we're reading in order to produce that evidence. It's very, very important. And the ability to cite evidence differentiates the strong from the weak student performance on NAEP. So students that do well with citing evidence on NAEP do well overall on NAEP. They have higher scores generally altogether. So this is talking about, and we probably know these areas as well. We are either reading, writing, and speaking to persuade somebody to do something, we're doing that to try to explain something to somebody, or we're conveying our own experiences. And you can think about that is the way we went with the 5th, 8th, and 11th grade writing test if you were familiar with that. But if you look at this as well, as we go from 4th to 12th grade, and this is from your standards as well, as we go from 4th to 12th grade, you see that to persuade somebody for something goes up as we get through 12th grade. And if we want to explain something, it also goes up. But to convey our own personal experiences decreases. It goes down. So it is important to be able to convey your experiences as an adult, but we usually don't do that much in the workforce. We have to be able to explain whatever we're working on, the project we're working on at our job. We have to be able to explain what we've read if we're talking to our college professor, and we have to be able to persuade somebody in an argument to our point of view, and we have to do that with evidence, not just because I like it or because I feel that way. So students, these standards call for students to be able to persuade and explain in their writing and in their speaking and listening as they go through the standards. So in thinking about this chart, we're going to have less talking about our own experiences, and we're going to have more talking that students should be able to explain and persuade. Then let's take about 2 minutes again, and let's think about these two questions. What types of writing typically occurs in science and social studies classrooms? So what's going on? If you're not a science or social studies teacher and you teach another area, think about your classroom. And how do these percentage requirements for writing support the development of? These are actual careers: historians, scientists, art critics, medical technicians. So think about the subject you teach, and then think about a career in that area, and think about these two questions. But substitute in what you teach and a career that would come out of your course that you teach. And you can talk with a partner near you, and let's take 2 minutes for that. Okay, so let's pull back together. And thinking about the last slide, where students are going to be required to be able to persuade and to explain more so than to convey their own experiences. Just thinking personally, we won't share out at this point, but that this is the type of writing that typically is happening in your house. Going to help students to be prepared to be able to explain and persuade more after they leave your classroom than in the past. So you may want to just kind of think about that. And then the second question, how do these percentages requirements help support the development of some of these areas? So do you think that, I mean, we think about history, but does a historian need to be able to persuade and to explain more so than to convey experiences? Yes. So if I'm a history teacher, then those first two areas are going to be where my students are going to really need to focus more, and so forth. And you can think about that with the other subjects as well as you move on. So looking at the third shift, which is regular practice with complex text and academic language. So we're not going to get into a lot of detail, but I want to talk about both of these just a little bit. And first, in talking about those, I want to talk about, well, let me look one more screen. So in this, so why are we doing it? Gaps between complexity of college and high school texts are huge. So if we think about it, and we think about moving between grade levels in school, so let's say that I have 6th grade and it's my history text, goes from here, and then 7th grade jumps to here, and then 8th grade jumps here. But if I'm thinking about high school 12th grade, 11th and 12th grade high schools here, college jumps here. So you have this huge jump between high school textbooks and college textbooks. So the difference in the complexity of the reading level when they leave high school, when they go to college, is huge. So they do stair step as they go through school, but then you've got this giant jump. So stepping up the text complexity is huge because there's just too big a gap currently between high school and college books. What students can read in terms of complexity is the greatest predictor of success in college. And that's from an ACT study. Too many students are reading to low level. We just talked about it. Their textbooks are there. Students, standards include a staircase of increasing text complexity, and that goes from elementary to high school. So when you heard Emily Barton, if you were in this last session, she talked about the fact that standards previously didn't actually address text complexity. The Common Core State Standards do. And that complexity is a staircase every year from kindergarten, well, we don't quite start at kindergarten, but all the way from second and third grade where you have Lexile levels, all the way up through 12th grade. So you do have that there, and that's not been in standards of the past in Tennessee or in other states as well. Okay, the last part, the standards focus on building general academic vocabulary, and this is very crucial for comprehension. And in Tennessee, we've had a focus on what we call Tier 3 words, and that's the words that are specific to your content area. So, for example, photosynthesis is a Tier 3 word for science. It is content specific. I'm probably not going to be talking about photosynthesis in my math class, or at least not developing that term to mastery with my students in math. So it's very specific to my science class. So Tier 3 words. So we in Tennessee have kind of focused on those Tier 3 words. We had our academic vocabulary list. Those were Tier 3 words as well in the subjects, the tested areas. Tier 2 words, however, are words that students need to know in their everyday language, but they're still, it's still a complex word. Like, for example, and I even listed some here, theory, alternative, evaluate, demonstrate, ignite, so explain. Those are words that students need to know. They're complex words. They're not real simple words, but they need to know those words for the workforce, for college and career. And so Tier 2 words are very important, and there's a focus on Tier 2 words with the literacy and the Common Core State Standards. So as you're working with your class, and if it happens to be science, so it is very important that you teach them photosynthesis if that's the grade, and that's probably what 5th or 6th grade. I don't have it memorized what grade level. And we also work with cellular respiration in high school, so I guess it can go all the way through. But the point is that you do have to teach your Tier 3 content words, but it's extremely important that you also focus and you go through Tier 2 words with students as well. So, and if you're not familiar with Tier 1, 2, and 3, I'll be glad to afterwards to talk with you a little bit more about that in detail. And you can also Google Tier 1, 2, and 3 words as well and get a wealth of information on that as well. But Common Core State Standards has a focus on Tier 2 words. Text complexity, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but it's more than just the reading level. You have to take into consideration the age of the students and the appropriateness and so forth. This is in Appendix A of the English Language Arts Standards. So if you really want to dig into more with text complexity, you can do that. So I just put this there for you that you could dig into a little bit later and more in detail. Here are two pieces of text. And so just want to give you about 1 minute to read both of them. So which piece of text is more complex, left or right? Left. On the right, does anybody want to take a guess at what grade level the piece of text is on the right? I heard 4th, I heard 5th. Anybody think anything different than 4th or 5th? It's a 2nd and 3rd grade band. 2nd and 3rd grade. Text number 1 is 11th grade. But definitely y'all peg that it is more complex. Some of the things that make it more complex, of course, more complex sentences, of course. You actually have some of the sentences that pull things together to where things are synthesized, more sophisticated vocabulary, the content of it is more sophisticated, and so forth. We're not going to have time to really go in detail in a close reading. So how many of you have heard here lately when thinking about Common Core State Standards talking about close reading? Okay. So close reading is for any subject area. It's not just for the English Language Arts class, and it's just a strategy to help your students comprehend what they're reading. So I'm just going to describe it at a very high level because we could have done an hour and done a close reading activity and we could have really went into it. So if you're not familiar with it, I want to encourage you to look into that. So talk to an English Language Arts teacher, look online. I'll be here afterwards if you have some questions as well. But basically, when we talk about close reading, this requires prompting your students with text-dependent questions to unpack a piece of complex text so that they can gain that knowledge. And so I'm going to kind of just give you a little summary. So let's say that I'm in a history class, and let's say it's high school, and so maybe I'm going to give my students the Gettysburg Address, and so it can fit on one page, and so I'm going to pass that out. It's got several paragraphs. I don't have memorized how many. But so I'm going to give them that piece of text. And so first I'm going to ask them to read it quietly to themselves. Read it quietly to themselves. And then when they finish, I'm going to go back and read it to them. And so then I'm going to read the text. And that is very important. One, they've read the text on their own. So even if they're a struggling reader, they've tried to read that text. But the important part about me going back as the teacher and reading it to them is they're going to hear a master reader be able to read with the tone, making sure you pause where you're supposed to, and so forth. So it's important that you go back and read to them. Then at that point, you can start asking questions. And as you ask questions about the piece of text and as you go through it with the students, you need to build. And your questions need to go from simpler to more complex. And your questions also need to prompt students to look back at the text and provide evidence from the text. So then after I've read it, I might say, okay, let's reread the first sentence. And I'll have them read it to themselves or ask a student to read the first sentence maybe. And then I'm going to ask a question about that. And it may be a simple question. And then I might say, okay, let's reread the first paragraph. Everybody take a minute, read the first paragraph to yourself. And so they're going to do that. And I may ask some questions about that. And then I may get to questions that talks about the purpose of the body of the text as I move on. So you're going to have them read the whole text. You're going to read it to them so they hear a good reader read the piece of text, and then you're going to break it down, read pieces of it. You're going to ask questions. They're going to have to produce evidence from the text, and you'll go through that. And so there are a lot of different, even online and a lot of sources that you can find examples to help you do a close reading activity, but it's your content, and the purpose of it is not teaching them to read. The purpose of it is guiding them to comprehend what they're reading, and it is your content that they're doing that with. So a close reading activity is a very good way for you to take text in your content area and students grasp and understand that text. And so this is not teaching students to read. This is a strategy for you to use in your classroom for students to understand your content. These are just some different ways, and I'm not going to go into them a lot, but chunking, and you've probably heard about that. I've heard elementary to high school teachers talking about chunking their content and reading, and that's one of the things we just talked about. Go back and do just this paragraph. Go back and do just this sentence and ask questions about it. Reading and rereading, that's also in a close read activity. Read aloud, so they could read aloud to each other. You read aloud to them. Strategic thinking out loud. Doesn't matter if you're kindergarten or you're a 12th grade teacher. It is very important that you think out loud to your students. So you pretend like you're one of them at that level and you think out loud. You don't think for them, you give them examples. And it could be including thinking something incorrect and then saying, oh, wow, no, I probably blah, blah, blah. And you correct yourself in your thinking because they're going to go through that process as well. Where it has recording here, that might be something that's good for ELL students, emergent readers, students that are very low and struggling readers. That would not be for your general population. Annotations, I'll talk about that in just a second. Paraphrasing and journaling, both good ways to help students grasp the text that they're reading. This is, and I'm not going to go through it in detail, this is just one example of ways that you can teach students to write in the margin. So if you actually copy a piece of text for them and you hand it to them, you can teach them not going to write in their textbook, but you can teach them if you copy something to write around. So as they read through it, you can ask them to take notes on what they're reading, and that helps them understand. So if they know they have a question about one area, you might teach them to put a question mark there. If they see somewhere that there's a connection to something else they've already done, then you can have them put the C and so forth. So, and I'll show you where you can get this PowerPoint so you can see it. That's just one strategy. So in thinking about the 3 shifts, these shifts mean that we're changing from basically having content knowledge that's primarily from teacher lecture, that's just you're handing them the knowledge, to content knowledge that's coming from a balance of reading and writing, which are some of the things we've been talking about, still some lecture, and hands-on experience. So it is a shift in the way that we've been used to teaching. And so I want to jump in right here, and I want to give an example. So when Common Core, when I really first started looking at it, when I was still in a district, when I wasn't with the Department of Education, I worked real closely with the supervisor of career and technical education. We did a lot of PD together, and we did a lot of work together. So when we were first talking about it, he's like, well, just tell me exactly what it would look like in the welding class. Tell me exactly what in the world the literacy standards going to look like in auto mechanics. And so as we talked about that and I thought through that, this is the example that I gave him and that we kind of went through, and I've used it a lot since then. So if I think about the way traditionally that auto mechanics was, so they would take row in the classroom and they'd run down to the shop and the teacher would model for the students. And I'm not saying that that's still a good strategy. It takes multiple strategies to teach students. So that's still a good strategy, but they do it and the teacher would model. So let's say they're going to rebuild a carburetor. So the auto mechanics teacher has the model, works on rebuilding, the students watch, some of the students might help a little bit, and they do that. And then the students practice on their own, and that's kind of generally the way it worked. And you've got the Chevrolet or whatever here that they're working on. But if we think about that, what that's done is that showed that student how to change that particular carburetor for that make and model for probably a certain year span of that type of car. So when the student graduates, could they, have a job and could they work with that? Yes. But the thing is that 10 years down the road, that make and model is starting to get a little outdated and some other cars are going to start streaming in that are going to be newer makes and models. And they might have a more complicated engine. And you, the CTE teacher, would not be there for that student to stand beside him and model for that student that new type of carburetor to rebuild it. So what does that adult at that point, 10 years down the road, have to do? They have to get the manual for that make and model, and they have to figure out how to do that with that new car. And so if we just strictly lecture alone and model for students, and we don't teach them how to access content through reading in your area, and we just model for them or we just lecture through them, then 10 years down the road, you are not standing beside them anymore to show them how to do that. So a better way maybe necessarily to do that same lesson would be to start in the classroom and to give maybe the manual for that make and model of that car and have the student read through pieces that talked about rebuilding that carburetor. And then have the students get together and pair up and talk about what they've learned. And you could do a close reading with part of it. And you could ask them questions that goes back to them producing evidence from that manual that they're reading. And you work through that activity. Then you go down to the shop or in the classroom and you have the model. You let them work a little bit on it, then you help them and so forth. So the thing is at that point, they've still done a good job and they've learned how to rebuild that particular carburetor, but they also learned how to access the information in the manual on their own. So 10 years down the road, they can do the same thing with the new manual for the new make and model. And so in thinking about that, I want to jump back to, if you were in the last session with Emily Barton, when she talked about the fishes and the loaves at the end, I want to talk about fish. So not the same story, but I want to talk about it. So as a high school teacher, I had to sit through graduation. How many high school teachers have to sit through graduation every year? Every year, yeah. It's something. So you get really tired of hearing about a Care Bear, a strawberry shortcake, or all that stuff those sweet little valedictorians want to talk about. If it's a girl, you get to hear all that cutesy and every toy they played with. So every year you sit through those valedictorian and salutatorian speeches and you listen to them. So one year a gentleman got up and he was valedictorian, and I had actually had him in my class, and he said, I'm going to be very short with my speech. And so I'm thinking, that means 10 minutes, And he said, and he did like a 30-second thank you to everybody, parents and teachers. And then he said, all I want to say is I want to leave you with a piece of advice that my grandfather gave me. My grandfather told me that if I give a man a fish, I've fed him for a day. But if I teach a man to fish, I've fed him for a lifetime. So we've been giving students a fish. We need to learn to teach students to fish. And it's very important in those other subjects that you teach them how to access the content on their own and then go through the lectures and the other things. So I'm not saying throw lecture out the window. I'm not saying throw modeling out the window. It's all important pieces of teaching. But you have to teach in a variety of ways, and you can start with teaching them to understand and access the content on their own with your guidance, so then they can do it on their own without your guidance when you're not there 10 years down the road with those students. So in saying that, I think I've got like just 2 minutes, and I'm going to very quickly show you where you can access all of this. So this PowerPoint is not mine. I stole the PowerPoint from achievethecore.org. It's the middle web page. If you go to achievethecore.org and you click on Steal These Tools, there are professional development modules there. It is all open source. You can take the PowerPoint, you can tweak it, you can add to it. It gives you notes on the PowerPoint. It gives you activities. I actually have 2 activities at the end. It gives you the handouts, and there's tons of stuff there. This is a reliable source. It has lots of stuff for literacy, math, and ELA. So go to Achieve the Core and steal their tools and use them. That's what I did. 10core.org is the department site where we have tools posted, resources posted. And then the third site is corestandards.org, and that's where you find your literacy standards. And then that's my name, and there is my email. So you are more than welcome to email me at any point with questions and so forth. So I think I actually have like 1 minute or 2 minutes if we have a question, and I also will stay in here afterwards if you have individual questions. If anybody's got a burning question that you want to ask in front of the whole group, I have 1 minute. Okay? Well, great. And I will still be here if you have individual questions, and I really appreciate you staying on a Saturday. That's dedication, and that's teachers, and that shows your love of students. And I appreciate it. Thank you.